Don't let rampant politics and clusterfuckery ruin all your projects and your sanity. Smooth ugly panty lines and make it all make sense. Get experience by osmosis here on Corporate Underpants.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Corporate Underpants. I'm Tamara Adlin, your host, and we are recording this live on Thursday, April 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. I'm here in Seattle, and it's a beautiful, sunny kind of day that makes people move here, and then they are shocked when the unicloud appears sometime in the fall and doesn't leave for months on end. But today is a great day, and I'm really excited to have our guests. For those of you new to Corporate Underpants, this is all about the crazy stuff that gets in the way of us launching great products. And it isn't where we think it is. It isn't really in our processes or us getting better at our jobs necessarily. It's in the problem of alignment. In my opinion, it's a problem of misalignment in organizations causing absolute chaos, which shows up in our products like visible panty lines ruining a whole outfit. It's the idea of launching your org structure and all the communication problems that go with that, which is also called Conway's Law. But Corporate Underpants is more fun to say than Conway's Law. So today I'm very excited because our guest is coming soon and has written a book. And I think there's a lot of interesting ways to combine the way that he thinks about things and the way that I think about things and the way we've gone about trying to solve, I think, the same problems that we've all been experiencing. And if you're in a position where you're trying to become more senior in your role in product, in management, in design, or whatever, all of these skills, these things beyond what we typically learn, are things that are going to help you. And they may not be skills that you thought you would need originally. So without further ado, I am going to bring to the stage David J. Bland, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, David. How are you?
Hello. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you. We realized when we first met that we have the same actually color walls, this deep purple walls. And we're also hoping that we'll hear from your 2 5-month-old puppies that you just got.
Yes, they're a little yappy, but they are running around outside. So hopefully we won't hear them too much over what we're talking about. But yeah, we may hear puppies come through.
Let's happy chaos into your life. So David, you are the author of this, and you can see that it's a well-worn copy of Testing Business Ideas, which is a gorgeous book. And when you first look at it, when you get it, you're like, oh my God, this is a long book that I have to read. But when you get into it, you realize that it's really more of an at your fingertips resource manual with tons of very short, tight, actionable suggestions for how to actually do things. Talk to me about writing that.
Oh, it was quite a journey. It was the first finished book anyway. I could say I have a bunch of unfinished books hanging out in Dropbox files that I tried in the past. And my co-author, Alex Osterwalder, who's very well known, created the business model canvas and founder strategizer, approached me because we had been collaborating and said, hey, we should write a book on this testing stuff because we're seeing teams run into the same problems over and over again. And didn't have to convince me very hard to do. And what we realized was there's like a list of stuff on the internet. And so people weren't lacking lists of stuff. It was more of how do I choose? And so we really tried to write a book, almost like game storming or innovation games, being a resource library for people so they can choose something that would help them make progress versus just having a list of stuff thrown at them and just being overwhelmed. And going beyond interviews and surveys, those are the kind of people usually feels comfortable doing those, but being able to get beyond those, we just wanted to give people choices.
I love that. I also love that because when I talk to people about searching for jobs and stuff, there's a whole category of things that you can run into on a job description that I call, 2 weeks and 2 books. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we can get reasonably good at with 2 weeks and 2 books. So it's not necessarily that we say, no, that I don't qualify for that bullet. And the way I interpret your book is making those things really accessible and easy for people who already speak the language of product and testing and stakeholders and all of that good stuff.
Yeah, we used our own process with the book. We tested it. We tried to find a reader. We had the value prop canvases for the readers. So we had corporate innovators and we had entrepreneurs and solopreneurs, and there were slightly different needs of each. And I have to say, it was a little get against what I preach sometimes because I was like, oh, you should have something very narrow for a very singular type of reader as niche to win strategy, branch out from there. But with books, the feedback we got was this is similar types of problems with different types of readers. Try to incorporate more into the book. And it was a challenge for me, but we tested it. We tested the covers, we tested the design, we tested the content. Probably too much testing. I could have time boxed the testing a little better. And I think that's why it landed so well and why it sold almost 100,000 copies and it's in 20 different languages, is because we tested it so much that there was a less likelihood of it to bomb because we already had leading evidence, like directional evidence that we were on the right track.
That's already interesting, right? Because buried in what you just said, not so buried in it, is that you couldn't just have a single persona for the book, that you couldn't do what a lot of us preach to do, which is to get very narrow in your focus and have a successful book. So how did you handle that? If that's what we're used to doing, it seems scary, actually, is what it
It
seems.
was a little scary. Yeah. I think it was a little scary because it goes against what advice I'm giving to people in early stage ideas was to go very narrow and learn and iterate. And what I'm learning on with books is really tough to iterate on the book. We still don't have a second edition on the book, and it's been 5 years since its publication. So it's not easy to get a second edition. It's not easy to do revisions. And I think the way I kept my sanity was that the people I was solving, so we had a book story, like a job story, jobs to be done for books. And I kept checking our content against that. Does this help people avoid building things that nobody wants? And if it applies to multiple segments, that's how I kept my sanity, in that there were overlapping needs. There were some differences, but overlapping needs. And we're staying true to why we're writing the book, which is helping people prevent from building things that nobody cares about.
And that's a perfect segue to how our stuff overlaps. I love that. So that if you go back to the idea of personas, and the persona for the book, it would have been appropriate to have one if it was one based on, I need to not launch bad products anymore. And I don't want to become an expert on every single process there is to validate my product before it's released. I need enough to try it.
Yeah, you don't need 100% certainty. I think we convince ourselves we have to be right. And I rant a little bit about this in the book. It comes back to our schooling and how we're raised of, hey, let's find that single right answer. And then it's not a shocker that people raised that way go into business and look for the single right answer. And quite often there's not a single right answer. And so they're choices. And we need some certainty, but we don't need 100% certainty to make a choice, especially on an early stage idea. So it's how do we get enough evidence to make the next decision? And there should be a series of decisions that we are making proportional investments in it. So it's tough. I think it hits at maybe some of the core beliefs we have and how we were raised and how we think if I'm right, I get promoted and I'm praised. And if I'm wrong, I maybe get fired or I don't get promoted. And so you pull that thread and it touches on a lot of stuff that we've been conditioned to believe over the years.
It pulls a thread that I'm fascinated with, which is it's not always all about data. And when you're talking about early stage decisions about a product or a direction or a business goal or whatever, it's not necessarily something that already has a bunch of data that can inform it. And there are really strong opinions that people who consider themselves innovators have. And so you have this balance between what people think is a great idea, what people think makes them into the next Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or whatever, versus how do you balance that with making sure that people want it once it's out there? If it's something new, if it's something brand new that they've never seen before.
Yeah, I get Steve Jobs quoted at me quite a bit. I think the way I try to balance that is have a vision, definitely have a vision, but test it against reality. Don't just build in a customer-free zone and then release it upon the world. I think we've seen some big ex-Apple people flop in the market recently with doing that kind of. When you get it right, it looks amazing and you look like a genius, but I don't think we get it right very often. I think there are a lot more stories of us getting it wrong. So go check, go test, even if it's just a small test, try to find a little bit of evidence that you're on the right track. And you can do that without putting your fully polished solution in front of somebody. You can ask about the problems they're experiencing, what they're trying to do, some of the challenges they're facing day to day. Have they tried to solve problems on their own? How much money have they spent? What did they hire to do those products, do those jobs? There are all kinds of things that you can tease out without necessarily having to put something in front of them. And I feel as if we make these big logical leaps in software development and product development, where we get some really light anecdotal evidence and we say, okay, that's great. Now we should go build. And then we make this really large build, and we may even iteratively build the thing, but we're still not showing it to customers. And then we launch it. And there's so many things we could do in between to pay down the risk between writing surveys and interviews and then launching a product. And I just feel very passionate about that.
And de-risking, I think, is what both of us kind of share. I think what you said about the culture is interesting too, because I come from 20 years of working with early stage startups, and the entire culture of the venture funding process and of shiny founders who are good at convincing with a 12-page deck someone to give them $2 million. If someone gives you $2 million, $5 million to build something, then you're really not inclined to test it because you've already been validated with money. And you have been also validated with the myth of Bezos, the myth of Jobs, that we can all be that person. And by the way, neither of those guys are easy or fun to work with. They're more like oligarchies than they are, even more so today, than they are collaborative. So there is a bit of a lie built into the culture around early stage innovation.
It's fascinating to me. I'm a huge fan of Eric Ries and Lean Startup. And I think somewhere along the line, he mentioned that book was written more for VCs, and then it landed for VPs.
Real?
So I feel if you read that book from an investment point of view, and you really bought into it, you would literally change the way you do investments. You wouldn't give $2 million to people to show you 12 slides, and now it has AI in the slide and whatever, and there's no customer validation whatsoever. You would, in my opinion, give tranches of money to people as they go through a process and generate evidence and make proportional investments along the way. So maybe they get 20K at first, and then they get 50K or whatever those tranches end up being, but they're coming with you with evidence, and they're saying, here's the evidence I tested, and I'm going in this direction now. What do you think? Or maybe I should not even go forward at all because there's no demand whatsoever for this thing that I think I should build. And I think it was rejected in part from the VC community, in my opinion. Now, again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Eric, but I feel as if I didn't see a lot of behavior change in investors. There are a few that will do like a, hey, I want to see some traction, and we go through this process, but I still see a lot of money, and the pushback I get from investors is, why would I make somebody do all this work and give them tranches of money and make it more complicated when this other investor is just going to give them 2 million and I'm going to lose it?
That's right.
And so the culture, I'd like to think we've made progress, and maybe a little bit of progress, and I've worked at 3 early stage startups, is people aren't incentivized. Like you said, they're not incentivized to go test. They're given money to build. And I would almost argue that, even some of that's probably the real estate they have for their office is more valuable in Silicon Valley than the actual company that they're building. So I'm a little annoyed. I'm not sure what's holding us back. I think it's somewhat cultural, but I do think until the behavior from investors change, you're not going to see startups behave differently because they're trying to get the funding to make their thing happen.
So I love that we accidentally got into this world of startups, but we're getting towards my core philosophy that as you become more senior, you have to understand more about what's going on around you in terms of culture, in terms of funding, in terms of what it's really like in the C-suite, rather than thinking that there's all this sanity above you. And if you just ask the right person at the right time what they want you to do, they would tell you. There isn't tons of sanity around you. For startups, potentially, I'm perpetually annoyed. My whole career is based on annoyed. But in the startup world, there are some venture capitalists who have started incubators or accelerators. There are organizations out that are quasi-VC like Y Combinator and Techstars that give money early. But most VCs are built on a model that they're going to 100x one of their investments out of 10. So if 1 out of 10, 100x's because the shiny founder actually did see it through and it caught a wave or whatever, then they're good with 9 failures. And that's not a culture that we're used to working anywhere below that. But it really helps to know that, because venture is never going to be set up to do it, quote unquote, the right way.
Yeah, in some ways, and I don't believe I'm saying this, corporate venture could be a healthier option at this point, because you do have some level of security, you should anyway, within a bigger company. And I don't believe the execs I work with are going to say go big or go home to, let's say, 10 of their teams that are working on new ideas. If the idea doesn't work out, well, there's new ideas. There are other ideas to work on, or there should be anyway. And so nobody should get fired or no one loses their job. It's let's pick up a new idea and circle and organize around it and go test it. And so I do think corporate ventures and the way we fund innovation and new product development inside corporations in some ways can take inspiration from venture capital, but at the same time, make it at a healthier environment where as a startup, like you said, you don't know that they've also invested in 15 other startups and they're telling them all go big or go home, each one, knowing
Right.
that they only need one to make it. And I do think there's less likelihood of that inside big companies, or I'd like to think there is. And you can almost take a metered funding approach where this blends really well into my book because we say, hey, go test and learn, present your evidence, and then we either pivot, persevere, or kill that based on what our evidence is and a strategic decision with our stakeholders.
Yeah.
It's a little more open. It's a little more, let's be transparent on how we're making these decisions. We know what the other teams are working on as well, usually. And so I just feel as if when done well, it doesn't have to be this, let's put all these different startups against each other. Let's put all these teams against each other.
Except that it does, because that's the culture of venture, right? So it keeps coming back to it is what it is in many cases. Like I think, and Pavitra says, one of our listeners, I'm working on a fashion tech product and will soon look to raise funding. Being a UX designer, this is a great insight for me. And thanks for saying that, Pavitra. Yeah, it's the reality of what it takes to go out there and get money and get support is way different than what we think. We think that if we follow all the rules of great product, then obviously we should get funding and we should get the support we need. The other thing that's weird about VC funding is that I believe that a lot of early stage startups need really senior level help if they're going to skip a lot of the known hurdles or known tar pits that exists in product. And the problem with that is that those people are then expensive consultants like me or like you or whoever so then the funded group should really be spending kind of significant money on getting help from senior advisors, but that doesn't really work either because it doesn't really make sense to spend. Anyway, the whole thing is a little wackadoo when you look at it closely, and it is still built around shininess and the ability to sell things. And that's why we also hear just as much about founders being indicted for fraud as we do about successes.
Yeah, Forbes 30 under 30 isn't seeing a good run. I think this might be controversial. So,
Good.
even though my name is Bland, I guess I have spicy takes. So I think that if you follow this process of I'm going to iterate and learn and test and learn and get traction and understand the real market size of my opportunity versus just what I put on a slide that sounds good, you may actually be less attractive to investors.
Wow.
Because they will look at you and say, well, that market isn't as big as I thought it would be, or you're not going to be as big as I thought you would be. I'm going to pass. And it's almost as if you didn't do any of that work and you created a really polished slide deck and you had some friends at Stanford, then you're going to get the funding.
You absolutely are. If you have
it's
a
bizarre
really
to me.
exciting total addressable market slide. Like these slides are all it's a template. It always is. And they always want to see the same thing. And so I agree with you. If you showed results from a small experiment, it probably would count against you because then you are encouraging the VCs to notice something good on a very small scale. And that's not what they're interested in.
Yeah. Sometimes I used to watch the show Silicon Valley a lot and it just hit too close to home because there is an episode where we're pre-money and we're pre-revenue, and that makes you a pure play, and it's just hit too close to home with how I see. Now, I'm not saying all investors are that way. There are some investors that would gladly invest in you because of what you're doing, and you're probably going to get a different level of investment based on it. But I would say in the majority, and I could be wrong, you are actually less attractive because the upside isn't as big as if you just made it up.
That's so interesting to me. When we got on early, we were chatting a little bit, and we were chatting about, oh God, I just lost it. Oh, I'm sorry. I just lost it.
Let's see. What were we chatting about? We were chatting about puppies.
We were chatting about puppies.
Chatting about strategy.
Oh, yes. We were
other things
talking
like that.
about strategy. Tell me what you said about strategy.
It feels very waterfall to me still. And I'm a little puzzled by this. And if any of you are watching and you have comments on this, please let us know, because I feel as if we've made lots of headway in the last 15, 20 years of getting teams to think iteratively, iterate through the problem, iterate through the solution. We have practices around this. And yet they're waterfalled out a strategy that doesn't really fit into that way of working. And I still hear the term strat planning thrown out a lot, which I think is an oxymoron, but we can talk about that. It feels as if we still don't know what strategy is. And we've worked out the hard stuff with the teams. And now we're puzzled why this hasn't had an impact on the organization as a whole. And I think it's in part because we're still not sure how strategy aligns to this way of working and what strategy even means.
I don't think we know what
Yeah.
strategy means. It's one of those things where it's politically a bad idea to raise your hand in any organization at any level and say, what does strategy mean? But we all feel like we missed that day in class, right?
Yeah.
And so there's organization. I talked about Amazon just because I worked for them like a million years ago. There's like these big strategy, like OP1, which is this huge, ginormous process at the beginning of the year. And my philosophy about that is that, sure, you can get clarity for an instant, a moment across an organization that big, but anytime more than one senior level person is in a room together, something shifts and no one writes it down, which means that the clarity is obsolete the second there's a meeting after the clarity is created, right? And that clarity is never at the level that's going to help you figure out where to put the button on the page. So there's this weird myth that strategy is like this cloud layer that's above us that we can't really get to, but it completely impacts us.
Yeah, it does. And it almost reminds me of when I first met my co-author, Alex, and we were talking about what's a business model. One is how a business creates, captures, and delivers value. It feels similar because we would mix up business model and business plan, and people are like, "Oh, we have a 5-year business model." And I say, "No, that's your plan, right?" Or we have a business case. No, that's slightly different. And so I think we're talking past each other maybe a little bit here. And with strategy, I don't know. I like Roger Martin's definition of it's a series of integrated choices, and I think that's pretty clear. Although obviously it sounds easier than said than done, but it just feels to me that it's still disconnected a bit. And I think we're trying to solve it with OKRs and we're trying to solve it with other things, but I don't know if we've quite solved it yet because I'll go into organizations and I will talk about how we're extracting assumptions and running tests. And at the same time, I'll have a board ask me, but how does that help us test our strategy? And there's some language barrier that we're not quite crossing here, or something about strategy that it's not quite clicking.
So this is where people who know me know that I have a really pretty strong theory on this, which is that there is so much misalignment at the executive level that is not recognized and certainly not resolved, that strategy can't be a solid definition of anything. Because to me, at the very least, strategy has to mean a bunch of people who are decision makers are in line and agree on something that is very clear and clear enough to communicate to the people who are actually in the trenches doing the work. And I don't think that clarity nor that alignment exist. I think that there is a lot of miscommunication, talking past each other, not being on the same page, not having your ducks on a row, whatever you want to call it, that nobody addresses because it's politically impossible for them to address it among themselves. It makes them look weak. And we, underneath them, haven't yet learned how to help them get to that clarity that we need from them. When I think of strategy, when I first look at any company, I look at, let's say, the first words on their webpage, and I want them to be, what do you offer that no one else can, and why should I care? Which also depends on who the I is in that scenario. Almost none of them have that. Almost none of them have the clarity to say, this is what we're doing that's unique and different. Basically, that's plain English for value proposition and differentiator, because they're too afraid to narrow in. And so they've built something that they're trying to make for everybody, right? And so they've built something for no one. They don't achieve what you achieved in your book, was building something that is relevant across different roles for the same goal, which is I want to validate my software before I release it, and I don't have time to take a class on all these methods. Your book is successful there. Most companies are not. They just are scattershot and have a bunch of features that are on there because they're shiny or they're chasing their competitors or whatever.
It's interesting. I think it comes out in different ways. So I'll do something like we'll do a business model canvas for the company at the C-suite level. And I had this situation with a company in San Francisco where the chief marketing officer and the VP of product didn't agree on the customer segment.
Yep.
That was news to me. I didn't know that until we started facilitating the exercise. And I realized, wait, we don't even agree who our customer is. So imagine the dysfunction that drives an entire organization when you can't get alignment at the exec level. And this is why whole departments have a hard time collaborating. We say cross-functional teams and we're all in this together. But if you don't have alignment at the C-suite or at the board level, what tends to happen is that trickles down and then they're given very different directions and they can't agree on things. And it's not always obvious because I come in as a third party, right? I'm trying to observe and understand what's going on and what diagnose and help them make progress and pay down their risk. Usually what I'm trying to help is pay down your risk, make good investment decisions. You probably have a bunch of zombie projects you should kill. You have some other things you should invest more in. There's other things you should pivot in different direction. And I don't know all this misalignment, and it certainly doesn't come out in the earlier conversations I have with companies. And so I almost have to uncover it as I get in there, and it just pops up in different ways through me facilitating different exercises, it seems.
The confusion has to trickle downhill. It's not that it's likely to, it has to trickle downhill because how can anybody be sure if the execs aren't? I think this actually would make the two of us a killer team as consultants into bigger companies because I'm all about uncovering and helping them show themselves that they're misaligned through this 5 conversation approach, resolve it before they start approaching hard questions about where they're putting their money, because those questions become a lot easier. And I love what you just said, which is you were hired to come in and very quickly uncovered something that you didn't expect, which is that the VP of marketing and product totally disagreed on who they were going after. That's so first of all, that's so personally validating that I have to say thank you. You got that story. But I think that's everywhere. I think it's everywhere. Like what people could do in their own organizations is just ask around who are our top 3 most important users or customers and jot down the answers, not to get anybody in trouble, but to be able to create a document without names on it that shows everyone that we're not aligned on this.
Yeah.
So you have all these ways of de-risking the launch of something, and I have this way of de-risking the internal communication and making sure that the hypothesis that is in the minds of all the execs is the same hypothesis. And then you're all about being able to test hypotheses in a sort of doable way with actual customers.
Yeah. And what's fascinating to me is a lot of these companies I'm dealing with are some of the best in the world at testing with their own customers. Like they have these elaborate testing platforms. They bring them in, they co-create with them. They talk to them every week. They have this amazing connection with customers and it's all external. And so internally, they don't use any of those techniques. It wouldn't cross their mind to say, I'm building a dashboard for a different group and I should probably go ask them what's the job to be done behind this dashboard. No, it's transactional. They said that I needed a dashboard. I built a dashboard and I'm puzzled by this. And I think it might be a cultural thing where it's just so much harder for us to use these techniques with ourselves. And it's almost easier to say, no, let's just focus on the customer. We'll test there. But when it comes to internally, it still feels very transactional to me in a lot of different companies.
Yeah. And this is where my Greek gods analogy comes in, right? So if you look at the myths of the Greek gods, when they fight, it causes storms and tornadoes and hurricanes and earthquakes down on mere mortals, right? But the mortals can't really impact what the gods do because the gods are acting like petulant toddlers arguing with each other. And we have this, what we do when tornadoes come through, we're still just so focused on what we're doing in the mortal world that we feel like we just tweak and tweak and tweak. And meanwhile, if a tornado comes through, it demolishes everything. And we're like, whoa, tornado. And a tornado could be a shift in strategy midstream. It could be that a competitor comes out with something and suddenly the CEO decides to change direction. It could be that last week we were a blockchain company and this week we have to be an AI company. I think that we can help the Greek gods be a little bit more chaotic. So that's the way I define this cultural thing in my head, is that we can serve the chaos and calm it a little bit that's going on above us if we do it extremely carefully. And we are understanding that the real cultural environment that they're in, right? Where there's disagreements, there's empire building, there's people who can't stand each other, there's people who are sycophants. How do we help them give us what we need, the clarity that we need, which is exactly what are we building? Who are we building for? Why should they care? And how will we know that it's a success? They
Yeah,
can't give us that.
and what I've understood just working with many different companies over the years is the hierarchy as a chart doesn't always reflect influence. And you think it would, you would think, oh, the CTO influences the VP of engineering, who influences the senior director. What I've noticed in reality is if you mapped all that out visually, you would see, oh, you know what? The CTO went to high school with the VP of marketing, or all these different sort of connections. And what you start to understand is that whole hierarchy doesn't necessarily hold up when it comes to influence. Yeah, it's a construct that we've probably carried over too much from the industrial era, but it's there and it's there on paper. But in reality, the influence and how people influence each other is very personal. And I do think, I know I'm half jokingly talking about how people are disagreeing and stuff, but having a lot of empathy for each other inside the org, I feel like we try to have empathy for our customers and we try to get voice of the customer, and we have many tools for that. And I think that's where your expertise really shines, is that there is a gap between the way we view our customers and we're trying to give them joy and create value and also make money at the same time and all that. Those can be used internally, and I feel like it's almost like a blind spot we have or something, where it feels as if, oh no, those are just for the customers. We couldn't do that here for us.
Well,
What are your
partially
thoughts on that?
because it's very risky for us to do that in our own careers. And on a big piece of, there's a reason that I'm an external consultant. Then you can bring in the person who wrote the book and thwap it down on the table, and I can boss around the execs without getting fired. Or if I get fired, it's from a contract. It's very hard to do this from within, but I think understanding it is the first stage. And I think we do have a blind spot. Think about anybody listening to this. Think about how you think of your executive team. Just really ask yourself, what am I thinking about the executive team? And you'll notice that it's almost like you're a kid thinking about your parents. It's this strange sort of otherness perception of them and what motivates them. And I love what you said about, you actually just brought up a topic that's in the great new book Aligned by Bruce McCarthy and Melissa Apple, of influence mapping and figuring out what's actually going on up there. They're just like our parents aren't organized all the time, and you get more understanding of that as you get older. Our stakeholders and our bosses aren't organized either. And they tend to approach us with solutions. So often I get called to do a persona effort, and within 5 minutes, I'm talking about how 2 members of the executive team can't stand each other. Literally, that's what I'm talking about with them, right? And that has nothing to do with data, and data can't solve that. Something else has to solve that problem.
It's tough. I have a lot of empathy for senior leaders. Even when they try to build rapport with the teams and try to be connected with the teams, it often backfires and they have no idea why. So for example, I won't name the company, but really well-known company in Silicon Valley. I was talking to their CEO and he said, I used to walk around and just hang out with the teams and see what they were working on. And he's trying to build rapport with them. He's trying to not stay in his office, right? Or isolated away. It's something that I would recommend him doing. I was like, yeah, go hang out with the team, see what they're working on, hear the kind of problems that they have. And I'm a huge believer of the teams closest to the problems and closest to the customer are really going to be your new revenue generating opportunities. If they have critical thinking skills, if they're able to voice what's going on, you can find a lot of untapped revenue in those teams. And this is the way the conversations went. He would give them like the benefit of his opinion about how they're approaching something. And at no point was he giving them direction or telling them this is what you need to do for this quarter. And he would have all these other people come back to him after these conversations and say, what did you tell that team? Now they're working on something completely different.
Yes.
And he would be shocked.
Yes.
He's not, I didn't go tell him to do that. And so it's tough because even as an outside consultant coming in and coach and advisor saying, oh yeah, of course you need to build rapport with the teams and be connected with them and walk around and hang out with them. And at the same time, just in his presence and just really just giving his thoughts on stuff. It's internalized as orders. We have to shift focus and go execute.
Oh my God. So with super early stage startups, this happens all the time. There's one example that I have where, as they hired engineers, was so excited about discussing all this new technology and ways they could do it with the engineers, and the engineers would put up with it. But it turns out they were like, get this guy out of our office because we can't get any work done. It was driving them crazy and he didn't know it. He was really enjoying talking to them about it and thinking that he was being helpful as the person who got all the money that then hired them. And they were like, stop. In another instance, with a company, I worked directly with the CEO, and they were like, I just want to hire a team that I can really think about stuff with and collaborate with, and we can have this great interaction. And the message to him was, you can't ever not be the CEO. So everything that comes out of your mouth is something that's coming out of the mouth of the CEO. You can't hire collaborators because you're always going to be their boss. So just noodling on stuff can completely change the direction of the entire company. And he was so disappointed because he never even thought of that. Oh, shit. Every time I say anything, the CEO is saying something, which is exactly what you just said.
And the feedback in extending conversation with the CEO, he said, like, the feedback doesn't get back to me. It goes up sometimes, and then it goes like this. And
so you
like,
made a
sometimes,
swirling motion with your finger. So
yeah, so it's kind of, sometimes they need external, even CEOs need coaching, right? And people that are external, they can observe and say, hey, do you see how the team behaved after you said this? Or can you see how this did this? And they don't always receive that feedback from their org because they don't want to give the feedback to the CEO. So I do think it's like us, like even coaches need coaches.
Yeah.
And so CEOs need somebody that can give them that kind of feedback and help them. And I feel as if it's the ones that don't seek out coaching, it's really tough because they're trying to navigate this all and they're not even aware of what's going on and how they're influencing things.
And they end up hitting very predictable problems that people with experience could have helped them see around that corner. And the other problem is that the people who have that experience are getting older and older. Like now suddenly I am not the youngest person in the room anymore. And sometimes I hear myself talking to these early stage founders and I sound like grandma telling them to wear their galoshes because it's such fundamental basic stuff. Me saying, at least think about the logic of the system before you build it. And this literally conversation happened. They said to me, this blockchain company, you don't understand the technology. We don't get the logic down before we build it. We build it and then we get the logic down. And I had no answer to that. But any answer that I would give would support their idea that I didn't understand the technology. And Duncan Shingleton, one of our listeners, says, I find it helpful to think of the executive team as my customer, what's their jobs to be done, their needs and pain points, then translate empathy for the actual customer into the executive narrative's language to show how it answers their definition of success. I love this. And the original idea behind personas was to bring data into the organization, make it into personas. This was Cooper's personas. And then through those personas, bring empathy all the way through the organization. The problem is that data doesn't always, in fact, almost never solves the problem that we're talking about, which is my hot take. Data should solve all these problems, but I don't think it does. What do you think about that statement?
It's almost like when you're having a disagreement with somebody and you try to bring data into the conversation to solve the disagreement.
Heaven forbid it's your partner. Go on.
Yeah, it's interesting how data can be explained away or be attacked. And I feel like with personas, it became really weird for me when I went into this company and they'd spent millions of dollars, literally millions of dollars on personas, and they just weren't using them.
And they didn't work.
And they spent millions on them. Personally, I thought, I'm in the wrong business. I should just be creating personas for people. But like, it has to be actionable in some way. They have to be able to connect the dots. And I think that's something we could do better. I don't know about you, but I could certainly do better at connecting dots for people because I connect them in my head and then move the conversation forward. And then I realize, oh, wait, the person I'm talking to did not connect these dots. So I'm trying to do a better job of just slowing down and just really connecting things in like a big animal picture kind of way. So I don't necessarily leave people behind. because you're right. We're not the youngest people in the room anymore. And it's also, I think sometimes we make assumptions that, oh, obviously they see the connections here and let's move forward. And that isn't the case.
No. And so that's why my own process has evolved. I wrote 2 books on creating data-driven personas. And really, since 2005, when I went out on my own, I haven't done them. Instead, I've done this, what I first called ad hoc personas and then called alignment personas, because I realized that the problem was something else. Now in history is if we don't realize that data is easy to not listen to now, we're living under a rock. But data also doesn't solve the problem that the marketing VP and the tech VP don't like each other. It just doesn't solve it, right? And so anytime you bring in data in any form, it's way too easy to wiggle around it and say, I don't like the way you collected it, or say that the market has changed in the past month and your data was finished the month before. It's way easy to get around quote unquote hard facts. So untangling the conversations, and that's why with alignment personas, I'm always like, they're hypotheses and you can go out and validate or invalidate whether they exist, but they also end up being so fundamental and about the fundamental use of the product, like Nancy newbie who is new to this bank versus someone who isn't new to the bank and is big into saving, or somebody who's in trouble and needs some help financially. They're so obvious once they create them together. And you can look at then at the product and say, wow, we really suck for anybody who's brand new. It's just really interesting that then when they have that focus together, when they're able to take on the perspective of a user successfully together and agree on it, there's so much we can do to improve our products. We just have to get them to let us.
Yeah, a lot of it's creating a common language, I've noticed. I think it's one of the reasons I'm brought in. People, they don't have a common language for what they're trying to do. And so just I feel like a lot of my training and coaching is around critical thinking skills and common language nowadays.
And a glossary.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the quotes I pulled out from my last couple interviews are like the power of creating. It's as fundamental as that people are not defining words the same way. Melissa brought up a story from one of her past companies where she had them define the word data. And I was like, that totally rings true. But who would ever think, and who would ever feel safe from inside the company saying, I don't know what data is?
Yeah, there's this phrase I first learned, it was years ago. I know I'm not going to be able to quote the source properly, but it was like getting pickled, and this idea of being pickled. And so as an external consultant, you can come in and you can start working with a team and a company. And the more you work with them, the more you become part of the system.
Right.
And this also happens to external consultants that go internal as well. And it's interesting to me. I have a lot of friends that have done that. They've been part of agencies I've been a part of, and they joined the company and they realize, wow, I can't raise some of the things I would do if I was external because of the environment I'm in. I'm part of the system now. And this idea, I try to keep it top of mind. It's like getting pickled. And am I getting pickled? Am I working with this company? Because I work for companies, work with them for years. And I do have to take a step back and say, am I not challenging this because I'm just really comfortable and part of the system now and I don't want to challenge it? And I feel as if, especially coming in externally, we can have a lot of empathy for people that are internal and part of that system and realize this is why I can't speak up. And this is why they hire people that can come in and say the same thing in maybe a slightly different way, and it works. It's like there's only so much social capital you can spend. And let's face it, like I don't feel as if the leaders are creating environments where people feel it's safe enough to say these things. So as leaders, I think you have to be mindful of, hey, this environment's going to be created whether you pay attention to it or not. So being very intentional about how you design an environment in your company, I think is something we could always have more of.
I love
of.
everything. Everything you're saying, because I think it was Mike Neff who was using the, like, how's the water? Somebody asked, and the fish is, what's water? And because you're in it all the time, and that's equivalent to being pickled. But also, that how do you deal with that from underneath? When I was younger in my career, I'm like, why do people hire consultants? Why don't they just hire great people? Why would they ever bring someone in to do this? It doesn't make any sense. Now, of course, it makes sense. And I wouldn't be powerful if I wasn't a consultant, because I have to be on the outside to be able to ask them the DNA level questions that they have to be able to admit they don't have the answers for. Now, if you're inside, you can do some experimentation. You can adjust some of the experiments and testing business ideas. Like what I tell people is find safe ways to ask hard questions. Send your boss an email that says, I think what I'm hearing is that our most important goal is to increase X by Y within 10 months. But we're also working on decreasing A to B within 5 months. Am I wrong? You don't put your boss on the spot. You enable them to say to their boss, oh, how should I answer this for Tamara? It's user-centered in that it's helping people up the chain help you get the answer that you need without risk, without internal risk.
Yeah, one of the tricks, and I think probably the listeners and the viewers will appreciate this one. I'm a huge fan of the framing of desirable, viable, feasible. And so desirable being
Say it again, desirable, what? Viable, feasible?
and feasible. So
Yeah.
DVF, you're going to see 3 circles everywhere. I remember talking to Josh Scheiden about where the origins of this was. He actually traced it back to Cooper, who traced it back to Larry Keeley and Dublin Group. And then I was in Chicago at Kellogg giving a talk, and I think it was a professor there. I don't know. It goes back. I've never gotten to the single source of truth. But this idea of desirable, viable, feasible, and I use that as a do they, should we, can we type questions. I find if I ask anybody inside an organization, even senior leaders, what they're worried about, what's keeping them up at night about something they're working on over the next, let's say, 3 to 6 months, their answer is going to map back to one of those 3 themes. And so if it's about, oh, we don't know if the market is big enough, or we're going to a new market and we've never done this before, and we don't know if they really have these problems we're trying to solve, like that's desirability risk. If it's, I don't know if people will pay enough, or we're charging enough, or if we can make this a low enough cost to make a profit, like that's a viability risk. Or if it's, I don't know if we can execute on this, I don't know if we have the right teams, or if we have the right processes, or we can prioritize this internally and scale this, that's a lot of feasibility risk. And so why I tried to do this in the book was, what I try to do is give people options, like depending on your type of risk, then run experiments that apply to that kind of risk. Don't go off and try a misalignment here. So you're not doing customer interviews to test feasibility, right? You're trying to test something that will test a theme. And when I wrote it, I thought, I'll just write desirability experiments and viability experiments and feasibility experiments. And then I realized really quickly, that's not how the world works. You can use the same experiment for different types, depending on the context. And so I framed it a bit differently in the book. But each experiment kind of has that taxonomy on it. It has those categories. So it has desirable, viable, feasible. And there are other authors in my peer group that use other able words, right? There's like adaptable and sustainable and usable and valuable and whatever. I try to keep it very common and very simple, but you can make it as complicated as you need to. But I find that if you have like this working model in the back of your head and you're having a conversation with leadership and they're saying, oh, this is what I'm worried about, there's a good chance you can map it back to one of those 3 themes. And then it becomes, how do we go check? How do we go test? How do we go find out sooner versus later that we're in the right direction? And I feel it's like a very easy on-ramp into the kind of work we do, because they're always worried about something, and it's usually going to fit into those 3 themes. And then once you get them to voice that, it becomes, what's the smallest test we can go run and go check to see if we can go find out if we're on the right track or not.
I love that rubric. It's so simple and clear. And I also love words like that are going to be well received from a business perspective. So no CEO is going to balk at having the words desirable, feasible, viable. I might have gotten those 3 wrong.
No,
brought back to them because they're businessy words. Just if I want to express something to a CEO, the best way to do it is usually in a spreadsheet, just because that's their comfort zone. I think you also said earlier, though, sometimes you get in there and you realize that what people are worrying about are very different depending on who you ask in this powerful organization, that it just doesn't match up. Are there any of your testing methods that you think are particularly, and I'm putting you on the spot, so it's fair for you to say no, particularly useful internally?
Yeah, I think there are a few. I would say the way I tried to organize the library is like discovery and validation, which I know those words have a lot of baggage with them now. It's loosely based off a lot of Steve Blank's work from 4 Steps to Epiphany, but from the customer discovery and customer validation, but going beyond just the customer here. So in the discovery section, and you can find these also in Luke Homan's innovation games, and sometimes you can find this stuff in Dave Gray's game storming and stuff. But this idea of, can we have facilitated almost like experiments or exercises that help us get priority to things, for example. So there are a lot of things under the preference and prioritization category that I feel was like, oh, maybe we're doing card sorting here, or we're doing speedboat or buy a feature, or we're doing something where it's almost like a facilitated exercise, but we have a hypothesis we're trying to test. And I probably use experimentation really broadly in my book and in my work, but I do that because I really do try to have an underlying hypothesis before we go run off and do things. And I try to view these as experiments that we're running to either support or refute, or like you said earlier, validate or invalidate those hypotheses. So I would say look at the discovery section of the book, because that's usually more the facilitated stuff, lightweight directional evidence kind of stuff we're looking for. And in particular, what I see inside organizations is we have a hard time prioritizing. And so anything you can do to make that more facilitative exercise where people feel heard and their trade-offs are very clear, little subcategory inside there, I think would be very helpful.
Yeah, and I want to pitch your book here just because there are so many books out there, and I really like this one because it's so practical. It's if you're sitting there saying to yourself, oh, I have this thing that I've got to figure out, instead of looking all over the web for like techniques and methods, you could sit and flip through this book and be like, oh my God, that's exactly what I should do. And then it's just enough information where you're like, yep, got it. And you can immediately start doing it. The practicalness of this book is, for me anyway, a huge differentiator. So I want to tell people that, because if they look at it and just see a big book, it's not. It's like a gazillion little tiny books all put together and oriented to just try it, which I love.
Thank you. I try to keep it simple. I've been trying to really, I would say 2025 is the year of me making things simple. And so this idea of we're going to extract, map, and test. We're going to extract our risk. I love those three themes. So desirable, viable, feasible. We're going to map it. I use a little 2x2 to map that, call it assumptions mapping. And then we're going to go test on the things that are riskiest. And I think when you think of it like a 3-step process, and you're looking at your uncertainty and you're like, okay, what are the big assumptions I'm making? Can we prioritize those? Can we go test those? It really doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Now, when you get in the weeds, of course, there are going to be certain experiments that are more applicable to your situation than others, but really just that 3-step process I find is very powerful. And no matter what kind of company I'm working with, it tends to resonate pretty well.
There's another basic thing that I've been thinking and saying for a long time to people who are coming up in our fields, which is every step of every process that we take should be relatively easy unless we didn't finish the step before. So when I find myself hitting a wall, or I'm having trouble journey mapping, or I'm having trouble getting them to accept wireframes, or I'm having trouble even whatever it is that I'm doing, though I haven't touched wireframes in many years and probably won't, I stop myself and I think I must not have finished the step before. Right. So I think that's another really good thing to have in your head when you hit walls in your own processes or in your own professional development. What didn't I get clarity on before? What step before did I not finish? Because each step should be relatively sane and relatively easy if you have what you did before all done.
Yeah, I had a hard time. Alex and I had a hard time deciding on where to put the experiment library in the book, because I felt as if I put it up front, people just won't read the rest of the book. They're just going to look through the library of experiments and that's it. And then we thought if we put it all the way in the back, maybe they don't read the first half of the book. And so we focused on this spot where it's in the middle, but it's 200 pages of experiments. So it's a big meaty chunk. It's the majority of the book. And my thought was, okay, I really want them to do some kind of prioritization first, because if they just jump to running experiments, they may not be running experiments that pay down their risk, or it could be not the most useful, valuable use of their time. And so I'm teaching a batch of startups. I'm doing one at Harvard this summer, and I'm doing one at a local university out here in Sacramento. And what I'm trying to do is say, all right, these startups are coming to me and they just want to run experiments. And this is similar with my corporate clients. They just want to run experiments. And so did we do the step before? Much to what you're saying. Did we prioritize our risk? Because we could be running experiments that are relatively unimportant or less important for these hypotheses that really don't matter near term. And that has been a big aha moment for me in my work, is I would get people excited about experiments, and we would just run experiments. And I realized, wait, we're not running experiments that are actually addressing our risk here. So it was part of me changing my style over the years to say, okay, let's do the step before. Let's make sure we have assumptions map, because we got to focus in on the stuff that could kill the whole thing if we don't test it. And what I realized was human nature we'll do all the stuff around the fringes, but we don't want to hit that core. Oh my gosh,
Right.
if this is wrong, we're doomed. Let's just like tiptoe around that and run experiments on other things.
Exactly. And something that people who aren't consultants may not know is that almost every single time, no matter what they say the project is, teams will tell me that they also have a lot of trouble prioritizing. They don't know how to prioritize things. They can't get organized around it, which is a symptom of internal chaos, if you think about it, on a whole different level. Because if you're not clear enough on what you're doing to even say this feature or this functionality would be more important than the other, then you don't know what you're building and you don't know who you're building it for.
Yeah, I think this is one of the maybe weird symptoms of the whole agile movement, because we gave teams the ability to shift direction really quickly and build iteratively and all that. And then it's like someone took the steering wheel and they're just yanking it back and forth, and teams are just
Yeah.
zigzagging everywhere. Yeah, it's similar to why I got pulled into my work, because we were just iteratively build things that nobody cares about. And I was like, wait a second, let's do some more work upstream. And that's how I got pulled upstream into lean startup and design thinking and stuff. And
That's
so
it.
now
Yes.
I'm like, what are we doing? It comes back to strategy and alignment, and we can be as agile and nimble as we want as an org, but if we don't have a direction, we're just steering it all over the place. And it's
Agile gave us
problematic.
permission to be chaotic.
Yeah, but ideally we have somebody driving the strategy and the direction in a way that is like what we agreed upon.
Now we're full circle back to the problem of what is anyway. I love everything about this. I want to be conscious of your time. This has been a fascinating hour for me. And thank you so much for sharing all this. And your own podcast is How I Tested That.
Yeah,
Is
it's
that
called How I Tested That. And what I do is I just interview people that have really interesting testing stories of, hey, I tried this kind of business in it, and these kind of experiments I did along the way. Some worked, some didn't. But we don't really focus on an industry or anything. It's just if you have a testing idea or some testing story that you want to share that we think people get value out of, then we interview.
Thank you so much. And it's been really validating for me and probably some of our listeners too, that yes, there really is a mess that is impacting you, that is at a different level than you're operating with. And whatever tools you can get your hands on, and David gives tons of them in the Testing Business Idea book or some alignment projects, may help you start to deal with that chaos. And with that, I will say thank you so much, David. Thank you, everybody, for listening, and tune in for another episode of Corporate Underpants coming soon to Underpants near you. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Corporate Underpants, and there's lots more to come. If you have any projects that you need my help on, if you're interested in coaching to become a senior product leader through understanding alignment and politics, or if you're interested in any of the classes or books that I'm developing, please visit my website, adlininc.com, and get in touch.